Good afternoon and welcome. This is the European Studies Center's Conversations on Europe through the University of Pittsburgh. This is the first of our series for the year, and we are doing it today on the question of free trade versus protectionism. Our series is sponsored and funded in part by a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence grant for the European Union, and of course by the University of Pittsburgh and the University Center for International Studies. These virtual roundtable sessions are a chance to talk to experts about topical questions, things we're hearing in the news a lot. And this particular session was inspired by the increasingly strident rhetoric, anti-free trade rhetoric, that we're hearing on the part of both major parties in the US elections currently, and in Europe as well, by both government officials and in public demonstrations. It seems that in these two regions of the world most responsible for establishing a globalist consensus in favor of free trade and open markets, that consensus may now be showing signs of unraveling. So to help us understand this and find out what explains this shift, how can we account for the rebirth of this kind of protectionist these kind of protectionist policies in the US and Europe, we have invited a panel of experts to talk to us in a sort of roundtable forum. So I'd like to introduce those experts and then jump right into the discussion. Joining us from Paris is Dr. Elvire Fabry. She is a senior research fellow dealing with issues of the EU and external action at the Jacque Delors Institute. Her writings her writings include Fear of TTIP, Globalization, or Middle-Class Downgrade, ? Which was also picked up by the Huffington Post and YourActive.com. TTIP and German Opinions, Legitimate Fears. And France, a Hotbed of Opposition to the TTIP, a policy paper for the Delors Institute. And so we're very happy to have Dr. Fabry here on our panel. I'd also like to introduce Dr. David Cleeton, who is a professor of economics and the chair of that department at Illinois State University. He is also the co-chair of the Economics and Political Economy Interest sections in the European Union Studies Association, and has written a number of relevant articles, including The Investment Slowdown in the European Union for the Use of Review, Will Juncker's Investment Plan Work for the EU Political Economy Bulletin, and Gauging the Potential of Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership in Use of Review. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Cleeton. And finally, joining me in person on my left is Professor Alasdair Young, Professor of International Affairs at the Sam Nunn School for International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He is also the chair of the European Union Studies Association and has written a number of relevant articles. Not Your Parents' Trade Politics, that's probably my favorite of the titles, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Negotiation. I might just have a question about why isn't it my parents' trade policy? And Parochial Global Europe, 21st Century Trade Politics, a book he co-wrote with John Peterson published in 2014. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. And I think to kick things off, I want to set the stage with something you've probably all been familiar with, but I'm going to start at home in the US. And then we will, of course, move to European Studies Center. But for observers in the US or watching the US closely, and I know they're out there, this election cycle has brought to the fore issues of trade policy that we haven't really seen dealt with in the past, because there was a kind of bipartisan consensus on some of these matters. And it's revealed a significant swing away from free trade. On the left, of course, Senator Bernie Sanders in the primaries argued vehemently against free trade. He's quoted as saying on Fox News, quote, "Over the years, we in America have lost millions of decent paying jobs. These trade agreements, like NAFTA, have forced wages down in America, so the average worker in America today is working longer hours for lower wages." Also on the left, Hillary Clinton, now the Democratic nominee, though supportive of NAFTA as First Lady, has since called the agreement a mistake. Though she helped negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership as Secretary of State, she has come out against it on the campaign trail and expressed opposition to both TPP and CAFTA. And of course, on the right, Donald Trump has issued a call to make America great again by saying in a speech delivered actually just outside of Pittsburgh in June that, quote, "It's time to declare our economic independence once again," end quote, to renegotiate NAFTA, to withdraw from TPP, to go after trade violations by other countries. So I guess I'm going to ask, because you're here in the hot seat, I'm going to turn to you first, Professor Young. Is this a reflection of voter sentiment that's driving these issues away from free trade? What do we know about public opinion on free trade agreements in the U.S.?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's actually quite puzzling about why trade is such a big issue in this presidential election, because Americans generally don't care about trade. And when they do care, they actually tend to think it's generally a good thing. Right? So the fact that it's now been a big political issue is an interesting story. And the thing is, there's been a lot of attention to the left behind, the people who supposedly have not benefited from globalization. That's the framing that you get, particularly in the US. You have Donald Trump in particular pointing to these people, Bernie Sanders also speaking to them. Interestingly, there's a polling shows partisan divides on trade, with Democrats more favorably disposed towards trade than Republicans, and Trump supporting Republicans being particularly opposed to trade. But the fact that it's a political issue, I think, has much more, because the situation economically was exactly the same last year as it is this year. But trade wasn't such a big deal, even around the discussions about Trade Promotion Authority. There was more public discussion, but not the same kind of public attention. So I think a lot of this has to do with it being a presidential campaign, and politicians pointing to trade as the cause of this undoubted economic suffering. In the UK, they pointed to immigrants, right, not to trade. You have a different, the same group of people, but a different cause for their distress. And so you have this situation where trade has now become a political issue. The other thing that's coinciding, and trade has been a big issue in presidential elections before in '92, and the thing that '92 has in common with now, in addition to populists on a populist candidate, is you also have ratification of a major trade agreement is on the table. Right? In '92 it was NAFTA, and now we have TPP. So there's both the presidential election and the proximity of a major trade agreement help to make trade a more prominent issue now than it has been, even though public sentiment hasn't fundamentally changed.
Okay. Are we having volume issues? Are people able to hear? I think I saw some indications. All right. And I should also mention, thank you, that for our other panelists, please feel free to indicate if you wanted to jump in on an answer and also respond to it. But let me take the chance to kind of flip the frame over and ask, as a kind of building on what you just said, Professor Cleeton, how does this current public opinion reflect economists' views of free trade? Because, I mean, at least from my, sort of understanding from college econ classes, free trade equaled peace and prosperity, and protectionism equaled wars and depression. So I'm wondering, sort of from the economist point of view, is there a consensus among economists today? Is this reflective of public opinion?
I think that economists really have a good consensus on the costs and benefits of opening up markets, be those domestic markets or international markets. I think we should probably talk a little bit to begin with about the context of these two economies, the United States and the European Union. The European Union has ceded trade policy to the EU level. and therefore they have a different decision-making framework than the U.S. does in terms of negotiating trade policies. We should keep in mind that the EU is really comprised of what we would describe as economists as small open economies. The majority of those small open economies have gone the single currency route. They share a currency, and therefore, when you are a small open economy with not an independent currency, you have to maintain high productivity to be competitive. And the example of the successful economy in the EU is the German economy, which has actually benefited from a little bit of a decline in the value of the euro. And the Germans are now running a record surplus in their external balance accounts. The U.S. is much larger, and it's less open. The portion of our GDP which is made up through trade channels is significantly lower than any EU country finds itself doing. And therefore, when we talk about a trade adjustment process, both positive creations of jobs for exporters and perhaps the decline of jobs from importers, that those really are marginal in the U.S. economy. We don't see the volume of new jobs created or destroyed through trade as we see simply through the dynamic, regular process of competition and innovation in our economy. So this political point of emphasizing trade and trade's impact on domestic employment really is a stretch in the global economy. We do have some bad trends that are not helping with regard to the growth in both the European Union and the U.S. We see slow investment, both public and private. We hear perhaps more about public investment, the needs for infrastructure growth. We see technology that impacts across many sectors and is starting to have larger impacts in the service sector. And those impacts of technology require different levels of job skills. In the United States, we suffer on the supply side that we're not providing the job skills that are needed by these technical innovations. So I would say we really should look at a focus on what's happened over the past couple of decades in the shift in trade policy in regard to several other factors than simply what we're seeing in the current round of trade negotiations and bargains that have been put into place. We have a major change in the way that corporations manage their supply chains so that what now are imports into most developed economies are not final products. In fact, they're intermediate products, which may go into a manufacturing or service sector and then be re-exported. So the clean cut between good exports and bad imports is no longer true. We're also seeing a big shift in developed economies into service trade, and we will see trade negotiations becoming more and more reliant on how we impact and gain access to service providers and service markets across different economies. And then finally, we have spent 30 years lowering international tariffs and quotas. So on the goods side of the market, tariffs and quotas are really of no importance anymore. We have found that what makes a difference now on the cost and competition side is standardizing regulations and being able to look at ways to economize on meeting the regulatory costs of entering markets.
Thank you for that. It's a nice overview, and it helps us point to some things that we want to do to maybe, help tease out what are the differences among some of these big trade policies that are currently being negotiated. But I wonder, do either of the other panelists have anything to say about sort of economists' views on trade policy more broadly?
Well, David can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression as a non-economist is that there's still the general consensus that trade liberalization is best for enhancing aggregate welfare. What has happened lately, particularly with the work of David Auteur and others, is that there's been greater recognition that the adjustment process is slower, more painful, and less complete than many economists had assumed, and that the other assumption that the gainers from trade could compensate the losers, while a theoretical possibility simply hasn't happened. So the economists, I think, have begun to pay more attention to at least the short-run distributional implications of trade than they had in the past. Of course, the distributional implications of trade are the bread and butter of the political scientists who study trade.
Excellent.
Can I just add?
Yes, Dr.
Fabry. Can I just add just a short additional comment to what has been said? Because we can read and listen to many comments currently on the slowdown of globalization. As it was just mentioned, the volume of foreign direct investment is slowing down, and the number shows that there's indeed a slowdown of trade for the past years, and that the prospect is that this number will be quite slow, under 3% for the coming years. What we have to take into account is that this assessment is made on volumes, and we also should notice that if we make the same assessment based on added value, then the conclusion would be quite different, because globalization may be slowing down in terms of volumes, and the distance of the global value chain are reducing. But at the same time, this volume is increasing, and particularly the volume of data that is exchanged from one country to another one, from one region to another one, has completely exploded. It has been multiplied by 2 between 2013 and 2015. So, and this reflects the digitalization of the economy. And what is going to be a major driver of globalization in the coming years is this digitalization, which will mean dematerialization of services also. But it will mean that this development of services dematerialized will not be. I mean, the meaning of the frontiers won't be the same and won't be an obstacle as previously.
Thank you. So let's take things back just a little bit, because we got a little broad overview of the two sides, particularly on the U.S. side. But I wonder, Dr. Fabry, while I have you, could you give us the kind of broad overview of the EU's general trade policy up to, sort of what has been the typical trajectory up to this point?
Trajectory. The European trade policy is very active, and as it was just said, it's conducted by the European Commission, which has signed or is negotiating some more than 40 agreements currently. And what is interesting is indeed that we have the same backlash against trade policies, and as in there's a simultaneity between what is happening in the United States and what is happening on the European side. Of course, as you just said, we have those two elements of the presidential election agenda, because we also have in Europe an important presidential election in France in next May 2017. We will have the legislative elections in Germany during the fall 2017, and this happens at the moment where the negotiation of the TTIP has put on the public agenda, this issue which wasn't discussed as in the United States, which wasn't discussed at all in public debates. So it's something that really got invited into public debate with the beginning of the negotiation with the TTIP. This criticism of trade comes is more intense in some specific countries in Europe. First in Germany, that was the most surprising switch, let's say, because it was coming from a country, as it has been said, that is a successful country in globalization, that found its way to engage globalization, and which has a very important trade surplus. The switch of the public opinion came during the spring of 2014, so it corresponded to the moment of the scandal of the NSA. So it definitely must have had an impact if you want to understand why we had this change of public opinion, because TTIP negotiation had to deal with regulatory cooperation. So it's closely linked to a problem of confidence between the different negotiators, different countries concerned. The criticism is also very important in Austria. In Austria, currently, it's the country where it is the more important, and we have the less important population in favor of TTIP. But we could find also some strong criticism in Luxembourg, in Netherlands, in the main countries which still support trade. We find them in the north of Europe. We find them in the UK, of course, and also Italy, Spain, or Portugal, which remain in favor of trade policies. And the criticism has been nurtured by strong mobilization of environmental NGOs, consumer associations, and groups from the left political parties, be it in Germany as in France, and they are very organized, and they have succeeded to organize a lot of demonstrations and a very important petition with more than 3 million people signing against TTIP. But I think we have, if I can just add a short comment, I think we have to try to understand that in this opposition there's a mix of different ideas and feelings. There's a criticism of globalization. In this criticism of globalization, anti-globalization feeling, there's not only trade which is in the trial. There's more globally interdependence. The feeling that the level of interdependence that we have reached is more and more badly perceived, and this is also expressed in the rejection of the migration phenomenon and the refugee crisis in Europe. And that's why we ended, for example, in the UK with the Brexit vote, with a very confusing mobilization and vote for the Brexit, with people wanting to recover their autonomy and refusing free movement of people, but at the same time calling for to base the economy on more trade open to the world, and which in the end we will maybe in favor of more free trade for the UK.
I want to just sort of draw out a couple of points in what Elvire said, which I think are worth highlighting. One of the things that you see an unusual level of politicization of trade in both Europe and the US, but I think there are important differences in the driving factors and which actors are to the fore. Right? In the US, it's much more in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, it's much more a traditional opposition to trade liberalization. This is very much the rhetoric of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. It's evidence in the opposition of the AFL-CIO. It's the traditional, it's the concern about the loss of jobs. The opposition to TTIP in Europe is much more about a loss of sovereignty, a concern about the implications of TTIP for enhanced corporate power, for European regulatory standard, much less so about the traditional concerns of job losses. And so you have very different motivations behind the apparent similar anti-trade mobilization. And it's sort of, and the Brexit situation sort of highlights is there the framing wasn't around trade, it was around migration, and then as Elvire points out, it was, the thing is now Britain can go and be more liberal in trade. So there's for some reason that the issue about people who have not enjoyed the benefits of the recovery in the US are framed in terms of trade, and in Europe tend to be framed primarily in terms of migration.
That brings up a number of issues that I'm hoping we'll get to, including Brexit. But first, let me ask my colleague to make visible a slide. We're going to share content for a second. And I want to come back to something that Dr. Fabry mentioned, which were these popular protests. This happening, the one I'm sharing is an image from Germany just this past weekend. So I thought it was nicely topical. I believe the numbers I saw quoted were over 80,000 people showed up in Berlin alone, but protests were throughout Germany, Berlin, Munich. And you see that there were lots of images, but this was given the sort of scope of the numbers of protesters and some of the visuals that are presented. So here we have this snake that has CETA and TTIP written on the fangs, and these American dollars being gobbled up by this sort of greedy snake. So it's evocative, and I think it's nice to illustrate some of these popular movements that you're both mentioning. And I want to get to this question of globalization, but I also I'm sensitive to some students in the room and potential audiences. And yes, we can lose the slide again. So really quickly, and I turn to our panel. These agreements that we're talking about, the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, CETA, TISA, TTIP, BIT. Are these, can we lump them all together in our discussion? Is there something that distinguishes them that we should be aware of that distinguishes them one from another? Are there some that are more illustrative of these sort of backlashes than others?
No, you can't lump them.
Can't lump them. Why not? I like lumping.
Right. Because they vary greatly in their ambition and coverage. NAFTA was a pretty traditional free trade agreement. You sort of have TPP kind of in the middle, which is primarily a free trade agreement, but it has some ambitions for setting some standards with respect to intellectual property rights, labor and environmental rights. And then you have the aspirations of the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership negotiations, which go much further to tackle the adverse trade effects of regulatory differences that Professor Cleeton mentioned is now so. And then when you deal, BIT is a bilateral investment treaty, which just deals with investment, is now being, you've had investment chapters in NAFTA, which was the first one. You have investment chapters in TPP and in TTIP, but they are much broader agreements than simply the bilateral investment treaty.
Okay.
Martin Stanley, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, Pittsburgh. This may seem a very naive question or an unanswerable question, but listening to this and reading about this topic, I'm always struck that they use the aggregate term trade, or they use the aggregate term globalization, but in any case, free trade. And what you don't see very much of is a breakdown on particular categories of trade. In other words, somebody says they're in favour of free trade. Do they mean they're in favour of free trade on everything? Or are there particular things where they would like to see less, presumably things in which they have an interest? It's a curiously kind of fused concept. I don't know if I'm making myself clear on this, but it's always kept at this level of generality. And I'm curious why that is, because presumably people's actual perceptions of this are often very specific, and yet it's just we are against free trade. I don't know if that question makes any sense, but it's prompted partly what Alasdair was saying just now. Excuse me.
Let's ask Professor Cleeton for a moment, and then.
I view the whole globalization issue and the trade component of it to be one about whether or not you want increased competition. Do you want firms? Do you want labor unions? Do you want governments to prevent competition? There's a controversy under TTIP about whether or not the United States would benefit from having a procurement system at the state and national level, which would open up procurement to European countries and companies. What we would benefit from having that done might be lower prices if we have a monopolistic position in the procurement process by precluding outside competitors. So most of this analysis always involves also a look at what happens to the industrial or competitive structure of different industries around the world. If you look at commercial aircraft manufacturing, you find really only two firms in the world left, Boeing and Airbus. There are marginal Canadian and Brazilian companies which are at the smaller end of the market, but the power that those two global competitors have set up cost and competition conditions which are very, very different in that particular trade sector than you find in the sector for automobiles, where there is much more competition and a much different supply chain network. So I think, yes, all these agreements that you've looked at over time tried to address different issues in terms of how you open up competition. NAFTA now is 20 years old. And what were the issues and the concerns at that point in time in that regional trade agreement are no longer on the forefront of where trade is likely to produce the largest net benefits by increasing competition. CETA and TTIP are at the forefront of that, and they're also the result of the fact that the World Trade Organization framework for multilateral negotiations has collapsed.
Could I just add to this, because just as an implication of what you're saying, I think to make my question clearer, it seems to me that if it would be better if international negotiation was not focused in the broadest possible way, because as soon as you have a new bilateral or multilateral agreement, then the people who are at all concerned get provoked by this or see a wave coming toward them. What I'm saying is it would be better, if you take the case of commercial aircraft, it would be better to have negotiations which are much more specific to industries, because then you're only affecting a much more limited constituency politically. I know this is an unusual way of framing it, but it's something to do with the semantics of this process. Anyway, I just throw that out.
Well, part of the point of having the broad agreement is that so you can trade off different interests, and those who favor trade against those who don't favor trade. But I mean, it's quite interesting. There was a Bertelsmann study recently which found a majority of Germans in favor of increasing trade with the United States and opposed to TTIP. So it's the specifics of the agreement is the concern, right? And there was a very interesting article by Naomi Kume in Comparative Political Studies last year, where they took Japanese consumers and some of them they had them think of themselves in terms of being workers and some in terms of being consumers, and which framing they had dramatically affected their attitudes towards trade. So there is this very much a bifurcated attitude to whether trade is good or not, and it's very contextual.
That's sort of what I'm saying.
Yes, so I agree.
Yes.
Just to come back to your question, Allyson, initial question, and the question that was raised, I wonder whether we shouldn't keep in mind that in the TTIP, which is quite different from all of the other negotiations, because we have this big ambition on regulatory cooperation. We shouldn't. I mean, as we see that there has been a lot of worries and fears and provoked by this regulatory cooperation chapter, with people fearing that it could lead to downgrade norms, be it in the European side or US side. There's a question that is legitimate today, is to wonder whether we shouldn't have tried to separate that chapter from the which concerns behind the border, barriers behind the borders, to separate it from the more conventional issues that have always been negotiated in trade deals and which are related to the remaining small question of the quotas and the tariffs and maybe even on rules on the intellectual property or other issues. And because I think we have completely failed to draft the good narrative on that regulatory cooperation issue. What was the purpose? How negotiators intended to process? What was the role of regulators? It's not in the hand of the negotiators, but in the hand of the regulators. All those issues have been, in fact, they are, at least in Europe, they are really one major reason of this strong criticism of TTIP, which has aggregated a rejection of trade. And has been an initial mistake, and there's a strong need to rehabilitate that purpose of regulatory cooperation and the limits of what it means, also what it would implicate.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's my understanding that there is some push for a sort of step one TTIP to at least nail down the things that we've agreed on before Obama leaves office. So another sort of result of this change in the electoral politics of the U.S. and this change in administration that we know is coming to try to nail down at least what we can agree on at this moment before a new administration takes over. I wonder, first let me say, and this is a brief break, we're actually starting to get some questions in from some of our sites through chat, and I am saving them up and I'm hearing them, so feel free to continue to send them in. And also, I will turn it over to our questions from our satellite audiences as well pretty soon, so get those questions in mind. But we brought up TTIP, and let me go back to what you were just saying, Dr. Fabry, and talking about opposition to TTIP in Europe, but in the United States, that's definitely not the one I'm hearing about. And in fact, talking about TTIP with people in the U.S. generally elicits a sense of, well, they don't know what I'm talking about, where it's very different, I think, in Europe. And the focus has very much been on TPP. And so I'm not actually even sure what public sentiment towards TTIP is in the U.S. Is there one?
Well, they're largely unaware. I do have a...
Oh, here we go.
I do, it's, I think it's the last, maybe even it's the penultimate one.
Okay.
There's very little awareness of TTIP in the US, but one thing is important to recognize that the hostility from the same kinds of groups in the US that are leading the opposition in Europe is very different. I mean, you have some groups like Public Citizen, which hate anything, any sort of, it's the, it's up, not the one above that one. This is a little.
It takes a second.
Okay, it takes a second. And so what you have is, so this is a little bit old and it's a little cheeky because it's at country level, but last spring YouGov did a poll where they asked people how much they knew about TTIP and how much they hated it. And you can see there's a pretty goodness of fit there between how much they've heard about it and how much they hate it, and the US is all the way down there at the bottom in terms of not knowing anything about it. And that's because it's not in the public discourse, partially because TPP is loud and present, but also because consumer and environmental groups in the United States, while not expecting benefit out of TTIP, see the potential. And so they hope that there's scope for raising U.S. regulatory standards to be more like European ones, where on the European side, it's all about fear. And you also don't have the same, a lot of the opposition and the rejectionist opposition in Europe is from groups like ATTAC, those associated with the Seattle to Brussels network, which are not as prominent in the United States. And so you just have a different sort of societal mobilization around the issue, much less coverage and much less public attention to it. And we're not really afraid of Europeans.
No. Well, unless it's their social models.
Only if we imported the social model.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Fabry.
Yes, in fact, most of the actors who are involved in the demonstration and who have aggregated that criticism were used to be in counter of multilateral negotiation and WTO in the years 90. Now that the WTO is, let's say, not devitalized, but it's less active, they have turned to the plurilateral and bilateral negotiation, and so the new objective to kills are those bilateral issues. And if on the U.S. side, institutionally, the TPP was really first in the agenda, and you could see that at the level of the negotiators. So the TTIP issue couldn't be really in the public debate until now. Where now, as well on the European side, now that we see that negotiation of the TTIP will be at least slowing down, the main issue which is coming in the agenda is the CETA ratification, signature and ratification, which is the signature of the bilateral negotiation between Canada and the European Union. And so the demonstration that we have seen in Berlin on Saturday, they were calling as much to stop the process of signature and ratification of the CETA as much as to stop the TTIP.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that are in the same vein, so I'm going to do my best to kind of lump them together. So coming from the chat, we have a question basically that boils down to, look, I can set it up, there's predictions for TTIP, CETA, Japan-EU free trade agreement in the wake of the SPD vote in support of CETA, opposition in Germany to TTIP. We know that there's the election cycle in the US and this changing mood that we've discussed. So one way of framing the question has been, what is the likely future for TPP, TTIP, and those agreements in the US and TTIP in Europe? And the other way of framing it is trade doomed? So, anyone want to jump in on, is trade doomed?
Highly rhetorical question.
It's certainly challenged.
It's challenged.
And the SPD vote was specifically about CETA, and they have made it quite clear that they view TTIP as a different kettle of fish. So if they voted against CETA, then TTIP would be more problematic for TTIP. Voting for CETA doesn't get TTIP out of the woods. What is really interesting is that no one cares about EU-Japan. Right? Well done to the questioner for even knowing what was going on, because he gets no attention at all, which suggests that maybe trade is okay as long as you don't do it with anybody who might scare you in one way or another. It's interesting when you think back, when I was an undergraduate, Japan was the big scary rival, but times have changed. You can now work out a little bit when I was an undergraduate. But, so, and the discussion is, will they ratify TPP during the lame duck session? That's probably the only hope for it. And So far, the official line is no, they're not going to try, but I bet after November, on November 9th, they'll suddenly decide that they're going to try. But up until then, they're not going to try. And TTIP has a huge hurdle on the European side simply because there are now so many veto players. There's so many national and regional parliaments that will have to give their approval. They're getting an ambitious agreement. If you have a narrow agreement, then they don't have to give their approval. When you have the ambitious agreement, there are a lot of places where they could go a cropper. When you're dealing with parliamentary systems, it tends not to be a problem. Ratification does not to be such a big issue, but when you start dealing with sub-federal, sub-central governments, then it becomes much more challenging.
Dr. Cleeton?
I live in a state that seems to have some awareness of TTIP. It's based upon some very big interest groups that have large representations in the state of Illinois. And I'd have to say the EU Center here has done a good job of trying to talk about those issues in the public as well. In central Illinois, there's a corporate headquarters for a company called Caterpillar. There's Archer Daniel Midlands, which is down the road. There's the Illinois Farm Bureau that represents farmer interests in a Corn Belt state. And in Chicago, there's a corporate headquarters called Boeing. And all of those are interest groups which see that they have a great potential to increase competition and make market decisions, which are not just based upon exports, which are based upon global supply chain networks. I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, and I picked up the weekend newspaper, and there was a report that about 3,000 jobs were going to be lost by Caterpillar in Belgium. But most of those might be moved down to Grenoble in France. So there is a very strong interest in multinational corporations in figuring out what the lie of the land is, where they can count on good government support, reliable judicial systems to enforce innovative contracts and financial instruments. And as long as there are potential gains from increasing the opportunities through competition and opening up markets, we will continue to be trying to put together trade relationships in these trade pacts. What the current political situation does in terms of slowing this progress down is not insignificant. But I think in the United States, as soon as the election takes place in November, we may, based upon the outcome of that election, see some major strategic changes in what goes on in Congress with reference to TPP and what goes on in reference to pushing forward on the TTIP negotiations.
Thank you. Let me take this opportunity before the conversation runs away with us to see if there's questions at any of our satellite audiences or here in this room. And it looks like we have a question from Dr. Linden.
Hi. Congratulations on an excellent panel. I want to thank the panelists for presenting a complex topic in an excellent way. The question I have, and I agree with the conclusions that are essentially political, the lack of a narrative, and the challenges. The one thing that seems to have been entered into this debate, which adds to the traditional polls on trade, is this clause, this highly controversial clause about dispute settlement, suggesting that corporations, private actors who perceive themselves to might lose by environmental policies or other policies, can sue, and their award in the determination of damages is done not by courts or any other publicly accountable institution, but by arbitration panels. It sounds like a surprisingly arcane topic, but am I wrong? That seems to be the one that galvanizes, especially people in Europe, more than any other, that essentially handing over key determinations to corporations. So I have two questions. Is Is that a misnomer? Is that an incorrect view? Is it possible, the second question, that the negotiators will simply drop that as the most controversial obstacle to successful?
We'll take Alasdair and then Dr. Fabry.
Well, investor-state dispute settlement is sort of the most controversial issue in Europe. Public Citizen has been doing some testing and polling testing and finds that's the issue that gets people to flip on Trans-Pacific Partnership more than concerns about regulatory issues. It's been around for a long time. The first time it sort of really gained prominence was as Chapter 11 in the NAFTA agreement, and that caused quite a stink. And the US decided it didn't like that system. So the US actually changed its model bilateral investment treaty, not in terms of how the decisions are taken, but in terms of specifying that government regulation should not be considered expropriation, right? Because the bilateral investor-state dispute settlement is meant to stop developing country governments expropriating developed country firms' property. That's what it's for, right? It's not meant to be used against developed countries. That's not what we meant, right, when we signed these agreements. Germany actually has more bilateral investment treaties than any other country in the world, which has these clauses in it. What's happened is that in 2013 was something of a fluke year. There was a sudden uptick in the number of complaints under ISDS against developed country governments. Overwhelmingly, those were in Europe. They were overwhelmingly by European firms against other European states, but that has got lost in the whole story. And a lot of them were to do with challenges to changes on environmental regulation, including, I think it wasn't in 2013, but Swedish energy company Vattenfall filing a complaint against the German government's decision to abandon nuclear power. Right? So these are high-profile issues, and it gets people exercise the idea that companies can use this non-democratic forum to challenge rules that they don't like. Small and medium-sized companies hate it because this is not a recourse that they have. Only transnational corporations can do this. They would have to fight through domestic courts. So it's a highly, highly unpopular issue with developed country populations. The reason it's being negotiated is the Americans and the Europeans don't think they need it against each other. They thought this would be a nothing. They thought this would just be an easy, we already do this, we're just going to sign. It's not a big deal. The reason it's there is because of China. If you want to conclude an investment agreement with China, which both the United States and European Union do, you really want to have investor-state dispute settlement as part of the deal. And if you don't do it with each other, trying to persuade the Chinese that they should have it becomes an even harder task.
Interesting. Dr. Fabry, did you have something to add?
Yes, the paradox is that the criticism comes mainly in Germany, and which is the country who created that mechanism, the ISDS. And the Europeans have been the most active ones in the world. In first place, Germany and the Netherlands also, and that's where the people are the more reactive. I think, in fact, it's a mechanism that has been used since the year 50. And they are in, it's not the majority, it's almost all the bilateral investment agreements in the world. Most of them, it's something like more than 90%. But it's something that has been discovered by the citizens, by the public opinion, suddenly, on the occasion of this negotiation of the TTIP. And of course, there's some new worries with the new regulation related to environmental issues, to health issues, that has provoked some rise in the claims that were launched by some companies. So there's a worry that what could be the inflation and the use of that mechanism. I think that now we are arriving to a very curious situation where, on the European side, in reaction to those criticisms, the European Commission has been promoting and proposing to the US negotiators a new mechanism which would be a permanent court for investment, which would guarantee some more transparency in the choice of the, transparency on all the processes, and some permanent judges in the structure who would be based on a much more scrupulous definition of discrimination, fairness, all the different terms of the mechanism. And the paradox that we have today is that initially France and Germany have been very active in promoting that mechanism. And whereas you have on the French side our Minister for Trade, Matthias Fekl, as well as our President Hollande, and on the German side with Sigmar Gabriel, Minister of Economy, which are very now in counter of the TTIP, but have been very offensive on the proposal of this permanent court for investment, which Canada has accepted to integrate in the CETA agreement. They opposing the TTIP while supporting the CETA agreement, in part because they know that it would be an important step for the creation of this permanent court, and which could be a first step for a plurilateralization of this court, and in the end, trying to open a perspective for more multilateralization of a court for investment.
That's fascinating, and I have to thank you both because that's probably the clearest description of ISDS that I've ever had. I feel like that's helped a lot. Quickly, do we have other questions from the audience here, or Florida, or in Illinois?
Yeah.
Is that a yes in Florida?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'm Brooke Carner from FIU, but I wanted to know if this trend of isolationism is seen as an act of a product of advancement of technology and the digression of the division of labor, and if this is the case, do the state's sustenance or sustainability narrate a shift in modern ideology, or is the Eastern versus Western outlook more polarized?
Did you read it? Do we need that repeated?
Perhaps.
Could you repeat the second part again?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do the state's sustenance or their ability to sustain themselves, does that create a shift in political ideology or modern ideology, or does it keep the West versus East dialect continue? Like, is it continuing that opposition?
And are you interested, sort of West versus East, or sort of developed versus developing, or, I'm sorry?
Yeah, West versus East, because for a long time, the West, we were more aligned ideologically, but now Germany seems to be more for the social welfare state, and they want more environmental issues to be taken care of. So I feel like they are willing to lose touch with property rights or give up those rights for more advancements with environmental rights, per se.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that TTIP is suffering from this tyranny of small differences. And the United States and the European Union have lots of really minor differences that end up having big economic consequences in how they approach consumer protection and environmental protection. But we've learned to live with different models of capitalism for a long time, and the similarity, like things like TTIP, force us to focus on the differences between them. But it's really important to recognize that, compared to the rest of the world, you can almost getting a piece of paper between the EU and the US is hard, right? In terms of what their systems actually look like, compared to the rest of the world, they are very, very similar. So we have to be focus on similarities as well as not just on the differences.
Yes, thank you. Are there any other questions? No. Well, I do. Oh, yes, Dr. Cleeton, yes?
Just for the general audience, I read today's Financial Times, and there's a nice announcement that the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is a DC think tank, has just done an evaluation of the two presidential candidates' trade policy stances. So the Peterson Institute website will have a lot of information about what might happen and some actual modeling and scenarios if Mr. Trump were elected or if Secretary Clinton would assume office, what might happen in terms of trade policies going forward, and estimates of job effects and trade effects. So for the informed audience, I would say go to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, and check out their evaluation of the presidential candidates' trade policy.
Yes, thank you. For those of you who are my Facebook friends, I also linked it on my Facebook page. It was very interesting and quite bleak, actually. That was the thing that I took away from it as I was preparing for this. Well, let me get to the other question that we brought up earlier that hasn't come back, but I'm wondering what the impact, and you hinted at this before, of a possibility that Brexit is going to lead to an increasing trade liberalization in Britain. So I'm wondering if we can get back to sort of Brexit, the decision to leave the EU that Britain has made in this vote, and what will the impact of that possibly be? I mean, I know we can't say exactly, on some of these bigger deals like TTIP, and of course Britain's going to have to renegotiate their trade deals with the EU, right? So what are the next steps? What are the possible implications here for trade? Big question.
Yeah. Well, I'll do the smaller bit first, the TTIP implications. I think on TTIP, the impact is relatively modest but negative. USTR Froman has already indicated that without the UK as part of the EU, the value of TTIP for the United States is less than it would have been, and therefore the United States would be inclined to rethink its concessions because it wouldn't want to make it's getting less, so why would it give as much? And on the EU side, the EU has lost one of the main champions of the agreement and therefore a voice that would push for a concession. So I think it makes what was already a negotiation fraught by sides not willing to make concessions even less likely to make concessions. So I think it's it damages the prospects of TTIP in that sense. In terms of what comes next, I don't think even Theresa May knows. There's so much that is still not known. They haven't even decided if they want to leave the customs union yet, so it's not. They have to decide to do that before they can even start talking to anybody else. There's so many things that they need to resolve before anyone will want to talk to them. They will need to establish what their position is in the World Trade Organization, so everybody knows what the baseline is, what they would get for free from the UK before they would negotiate. They will want to know what the UK's relationship with the EU is, because that will affect how attractive the agreement with the UK would be, and that's not going to be known for several years. And there's also the issue that, the assumption is that certainly a country like the United States would want to conclude a deep preferential trade agreement with the UK. The UK has clearly indicated that, probably, assuming it doesn't go for the baseline, would have a deep preferential trade agreement with the European Union. And what Canada has experienced with CETA and the TTIP is that it used to be you could have free trade agreements with everybody you liked, and that was no big deal. But these agreements where you start changing domestic rules makes life challenging. Because if the UK is in a deep trade agreement with the EU, there will have to be some sort of regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU. And if it wants a deep trade agreement between the US and with the US, then there would need to be some sort of regulatory alignment with the US, and you can't do both, right? And Canada was jumping through hoops to try and manage geographic indications with the European demands in the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement and the US demands in TPP, and they seem to have just about managed it, but it's becoming much more difficult to have deep agreements with major trading partners.
This is something I've actually been wondering since the vote happened in June. Is this possibly, though, I mean, your scenario also sets up possibly another option. Is Brexit going to provide a backdoor to TTIP? In other words, the US could negotiate that deep relationship, which they're much more comfortable with maybe with the UK because of this long-standing special relationship. And the UK wants to keep some deep relationship with the EU, and that regulatory convergence is going to come kind of through the back door of that channel. No?
No.
Oh.
UK would have to choose which way to go. The other way, though, the other possibility is that TTIP might find, if they make TTIP an open agreement, it might provide a solution for the UK, because it could, if it joined TTIP, but that would be a lesser agreement than I think that they want with, well, some of them want. Treasury certainly wants a closer agreement than that with the EU. Mr. Fox would probably be very happy with that arrangement.
Dr. Fabry, yes.
Oh yes, two small remarks. I completely agree with what just have been said. I think in Theresa May, the First Minister of the UK, Theresa May's narrative today, there's a need to sell to the British population that to try to compensate the slowdown of the UK economy in the probably slowdown in the coming years of the economy. They will be very offensive on the trade side, but there's really a problem of sequencing, because as you has been said, first they will have the step of the divorce, then the negotiation with WTO, then the new negotiation of the relation with the EU, and then they will only be able to, after they have negotiated the new statute with the WTO, it will only be able to negotiate with third countries, which that can mean years from now. And when the UK is commenting at the moment that they are starting some discussion with Australia, with New Zealand, with they have a strong appetite with China and with many countries in the world. The question is then, could they be able to negotiate more interesting agreements than within the EU? That's a big question mark, because of course the size of the single market is more interesting for some trade partners, be it the US, even the US, which is really interested and very already integrated with the UK market. But the size of the single market is completely different. And concerning the regulatory cooperation, the ambition, which is also to promote those transatlantic norms, is very different at the level of the EU with so small countries. So I think there's really a strong emphasis of trying to present a positive narrative, which will be hard to defend in the coming years. It will be a complex process.
And Dr. Cleeton.
If we're going to talk about the United Kingdom, we should also talk about its importance in terms of international finance. London is the largest international finance center. It has benefited from having the financial sector passport, which allows banks which are headquartered in London to access the single financial services market across the European Union. Even though they don't share a common currency with the Eurozone, there is tremendous complexity which is going to result from Brexit. Citibank, an American bank, actually has more branches, offices, etc. across the landscape of the EU than any other bank in the world. And how that relationship changes will depend upon what status they maintain by locating headquarters in London or moving to the continent, and how that works out with the two other financial market innovations that the European Union is struggling with now. The banking union, which is an intergovernmental relationship, not an EU-based relationship, that has set up a couple of solution mechanisms in terms of the single supervisory mechanism, where bank regulation has changed dramatically. The single resolution mechanism, which attempts to break the linkage between sovereign debt and banking crises, and the unresolved third arm of deposit insurance and what risk sharing might take in that area. American banks will also be very interested in how the framework, which is very, very flimsy at this point in time, how the framework is put together for the capital markets union, which will offer U.S. banks much, much more opportunity in terms of services they provide in Europe than what they currently are allowed to do.
Thank you. Well, I note with some reluctance that we are actually coming up to the end of our 90 minutes here. And I know we could continue this discussion. The one thing that we all had in common as we were preparing for this, the panelists and I, was that it was a broad, multifaceted topic with a lot to cover. But I think we came out on a similar note to what happened in our discussion on Brexit, also available online for viewing, in that a lot of this still remains largely up in the air, and it'll be interesting to see what happens, in a year from now. It might be interesting to come together again and see where we are after some of the elections, at least, have settled down. But I want to take this time to thank our panelists, Dr. Fabry, Dr. Cleeton, and Dr. Young, for their time and their expertise. I'd like to thank those in the audience, in particular my colleagues at the University of Illinois, Shevnin Oskan, and at Florida International University, Christine Cayley, for helping make this possible, and my colleagues here at Pitt, of course, Kate Bowersox, Ashley DiGregorio, and Liz Shellen, who helped arrange all of this and do all the test calls to make it possible. This video conference it has been recorded and will be available on our website soon, so please check that out. And our next in the series will be on elections in the US and Europe, and it's entitled An Uncertain Future, and it's scheduled for October. So stay tuned for that, and I thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.